Welcome. I'm Mike Osterholm, Regents Professor and Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. We're very pleased to have you with us today for what we know will be a very special discussion with two real experts that can comment in detail and depth on the issues of where we're heading with the issue of COVID vaccine. Our webinar entitled today, The Review Process for Vaccines to Prevent COVID-19, a Discussion. First of all, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Stephen Hahn, who was sworn in as the 24th Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration on December 17th, 2019. Dr. Hahn is a dedicated clinician, having trained in both medical oncology and radiation oncology. In his previous leadership roles, he was always carefully balanced executive management with clinical time to continue to serve oncology patients, his true passion. Prior to joining the FDA, Dr. Hahn served as the Chief Medical Executive at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, a facility that cares for more than 140,000 patients a year. Before joining the MD Anderson, he served as chair of the Radiation Oncology Department at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine from 2005 to 2014. Dr. Hahn earned the rank of Commander in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps while at the National Institutes of Health National Cancer Institute, where he also completed a fellowship into medical oncology and a residency in radiation oncology. He also completed residency in internal medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Welcome, Steve. In addition, I'm very happy to introduce the other participant in this discussion, Dr. Margaret Hamburg. She is an internationally recognized leader in public health and medicine. She was also the 22nd Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Hamburg,
21st, I think.
21st, maybe, excuse me, thank you. Okay, Dr. Hamburg recently completed her term as Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Medicine, serving as Senior Advisor on International Matters and a liaison with academies around the world. Dr. Hamburg is also immediate past chair, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the world's largest scientific membership organization. Appointed by President Obama, other past positions besides that being at the Food and Drug Administration, she's also the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS, Vice President and Chief Scientist of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and the New York City Health Commissioner. She currently sits on numerous boards, including the Lasker Foundation, Commonwealth Fund, the Simon Simmons Fund, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Global Alliance for Vaccines. Dr. Hamburg is widely published and has received numerous awards and honorary degrees. It's a real honor to have both of you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Really great to be here.
Well, so let's just dive right into it. We have an audience with a great deal of interest. So I'll start this one for you, Steve, but look forward to Peggy's comments. Over the decades, the FDA has evolved the most rigorous and robust approval process the world has seen, with a great and unparalleled track record. Many Americans are concerned about the speed by which the COVID-19 vaccines are being developed. Could you explain the standard development and approval procedures and how it's possible to develop new, effective vaccines safely in this accelerated timeline? How do you balance the needs of rigorous testing with the urgent need to make a vaccine available? Let me just add two brief comments to this for your consideration. How were these vaccine candidates developed so quickly? And are there limitations to the analysis or endpoints of the clinical trials given this compressed timeline? Steve, I'll let you start with that.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Of course, a lot of this gets to the issue that we're in a public health emergency. And as Peggy knows, our statutory authority is for emergency use authorization if appropriate, where we can use a standard of assessing risk and benefits to determine if a medical product is appropriate. Now, the speed of the COVID-19 vaccine development was really made possible because of advances in molecular biology. These allowed developers, manufacturers to understand the genetic sequence of the coronavirus and then use it either with established platforms or newer technology to produce the vaccine candidates. And then the vaccine candidates were rapidly taken through non-clinical studies and then in early studies, phase 1 and phase 2, to assess safety and then induction of an immune response. And then finally, this summer, taken into large, well-designed randomized controlled trials. And at the same time that the clinical trials have been taking place, the companies are making vaccines and scaling up manufacturing at risk. so that if, and I say if, a vaccine is shown to be safe and effective, there'll be vaccine available relatively quickly after the authorization or approval. And as you know, in a normal circumstance, what we call a biological license application, so that would be a normal process, that can take months to actually get to the point where you develop a platform with a vaccine, go through the preclinical trials, studies, go through the clinical trials, and then stop, analyze the data. And in fact, in most situations with vaccines, after the completion of a phase 3 clinical trial, the manufacturer will take months to analyze those data. In this particular instance, what is being done is these phase 3 trials are event-driven. So when the data safety monitoring boards advise the manufacturers that an event has been reached, so in this case, the efficacy of a vaccine, they will analyze those data and then they will apply to the FDA, either the standard biological license application or an emergency use authorization. Now, these trials are large, around 30,000 people or more who will be randomized, from which we'll be getting safety and efficacy data. And this is based in part upon our June COVID-19 vaccine guidance, where we asked for certain efficacy endpoints. We do acknowledge that for an emergency use authorization, that although the efficacy endpoints are very similar to what we would require for a biological license application, the follow-up for safety may be shorter. And so to make up for this, we'll be working with companies to have a very robust collection of safety data, what we call pharmacovigilance, on an ongoing basis after the vaccines are deployed. So the duration of safety for a vaccine authorized under EU would almost certainly be shorter than a BLA, but there'll be safety surveillance on millions of individuals. I think it's also important for historical perspective. If you look at vaccines that were approved over the last couple of years, some of these probably under Peggy's time as FDA chief, the number of people who participated in all 3 phases of development have ranged from a lower limit of 5,000 to an upper limit of 65,000, with an average of 21,750 subjects per vaccine. So you can see that we'll have a fairly robust group of individuals who've received any vaccine that comes before us. So although the timelines for development have been compressed, there are no changes to our standards, and we've been very clear in our guidances, and I think this transparency is important. What will be our criteria for an emergency use authorization, and what will be our criteria in general for safety and efficacy?
Thank you, Peggy. Any comments?
Yeah, well, just, that was a very thorough and comprehensive sort of review of the vaccine development process. And I want to underscore that another reason why I think that there has been an ability to move much more swiftly is that it's also about partnership, and it's about the sort of elements of the vaccine research and development and review ecosystem all working together. And really the importance, which is often forgotten, of FDA, not just as a bureaucratic regulatory body that says yay or nay to the final product, but actually as a science-based public health agency with a regulatory mission, of course, but the ability for FDA and other regulatory authorities to sit down early with those that are doing the research and development, both the academic scientists and the industry scientists, as well as government research sponsors, and really sort of map out what are the critical questions and concerns here. How can we think about how to do the development process more swiftly without abandoning quality science and rigor? And I think that really has been important, and it really speaks to the central role both on science and regulatory review and oversight that the FDA can and should play.
Yes, I think that having been involved with as much vaccine work as I have, one of the, I think, unappreciated aspects of FDA's expertise is not what some would think of as the bureaucratic side of regulatory affairs, but the science side. The regulatory science at FDA is really unparalleled anywhere in the world. And I think that clearly that infusion of that expertise into this process is really critical. which then takes me then, Steve, to the really kind of the next issue is, as you so well know, and we here on this webinar know, that the FDA released the emergency use authorization guidance for vaccines to prevent COVID-19 on Tuesday. You've hit on this already, but maybe you could draw just a little bit more on this issue, because I think there's been a lot of confusion that there may be very different standards for a EUA versus a biologic license application. So could you just draw out on that? In particular, how are the requirements for an EUA different from those needed for licensure? And given that, in terms of minimum data sets, how long would you anticipate the timeline to be to complete an EUA application once it's submitted?
Thanks, Mike. So a biological license application, a typical application that will come to us could be tens of thousands of pages. And after some period of development time, it would likely take months for us to review that. Very comprehensive information about quality management, and quality manufacturing, but also around safety and efficacy. The EUA standard is different by statute, and that is a risk-benefit assessment. It's also very flexible. It gives FDA a lot of flexibility. And as Peggy knows, this EUA standard really came to us and was put in place after the terrorist attack of 9/11 to ensure that potentially life-saving medical products could be available to people in medical need before they were fully studied to the same level we would use for approval. Now, that being said, we know that a vaccine is going to be given to millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people. And so the standard for risk-benefit changes, because we're not talking about someone who's sick with COVID in the intensive care unit. We're talking about a preventative measure as a vaccine. And so we really have to very carefully look at both safety and efficacy. And so this EUA guidance that we just put out on Tuesday really follows up on our June guidance. We need to see clear and compelling evidence of efficacy and safety from at least one well-designed and well-performed phase 3 clinical trial. Now, that's really important. We've been clear about the threshold of efficacy, which is 50% that we expect to see. That has allowed the developers to design these trials in a way to detect that level of efficacy. Of course, we want to see greater efficacy, but that is the threshold, and those are the predetermined sets that have been put into the event-driven clinical trials. As I mentioned, with respect to safety, we have a very significant number of volunteers who will have received each of these vaccines. And what our scientists did at the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research with respect to safety is they knew that the majority of adverse events from vaccines occur within the 2-month time frame after the completion of vaccination. So our career scientists looked at several factors such as past approvals and safety assessments and concluded that a 2-month follow-up is the sweet spot when making an expeditious determination about the safety of a coronavirus vaccine candidate. Now, this is something we've already communicated to the COVID vaccine sponsors, but the decision will ultimately be determined by the career scientists when we get the data set. So I can't prejudge what that'll be like, but you could imagine a situation where there's a highly effective vaccine, where we have robust safety data, where we'll put in place a pharmacovigilance program that will allow us to continue following folks for safety and make a decision based upon the risk benefit of that. And of course, we'll be asking our vaccine advisory committee as well to weigh in on these criteria, but also on any individual application that we receive.
Thank you. Peggy, any comments you'd like to make?
Well, I was just reflecting back on how when I was at the FDA, we used to joke that there were only 2 speeds of approval at FDA, too fast and too slow. And that becomes even more pronounced, in an unfolding public health crisis like the one that we're in the midst of. We all appreciate the sense of urgency to get vitally needed products out there, and a vaccine in particular can really make a difference. But we also recognize that even if it is demonstrated to be safe and effective, if the public doesn't have trust and confidence in that vaccine and won't use it, it won't achieve our public health goals. So finding the right balance in this situation is just enormously important. And of course, we also recognize that you're giving vaccines to healthy people to protect them from disease. So the standard and the bar for safety has to always be high. But this is the kind of weighing and balancing of risks and benefits, that the FDA practices every day. Some decisions are much harder than others, and this is a particularly challenging context where you're making these hard decisions. You need always more data than you have. But here, in addition, it's in a fishbowl of media and public scrutiny, but also, with a lot of external political pressures and competing priorities, needs, and interests. So it is a very, very challenging situation. And I really, applaud the FDA teams that are working on these vaccine issues. And, Commissioner Hahn has a much harder job than I ever had to do.
Well, thank you for that. So, Steve, given that there are at least 4 novel vaccine platforms in clinical trials, has an EUA ever previously been granted for a novel unapproved vaccine platform? And in that same regard, will candidate vaccines based on novel platforms have different review processes than we might have expected for other vaccines?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that sort of the magnitude of the situation, as Dr. Hamburg described, and the number of candidates that are before us, which are quite a few, that this is new for FDA, it's new for the country, new for the world. But all of the candidate vaccines will go through the same process that I described with respect to our scientific review. Now, we'll draw on different internal scientists with expertise on specific platforms as appropriate. But all of them will have pharmacovigilance plans augmented for vaccines that use platforms that have never previously been developed. But you hit on a really important point, because the risk-benefit calculus, again, if it's a new platform, that needs to be considered by our career scientists as well as by the Vaccine Advisory Committee with respect to the assessment of the risk-benefit. Can't prejudge what the data will show or how much confidence we'll have in those data, but that will be an important part of that consideration. And just to highlight one other thing that Dr. Hamburg said, really part of the confidence issue is around transparency. So I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here with all of the colleagues on this webinar, but being clear about what our criteria are, being clear about what the process will be, having an open public vaccine advisory committee, all of those I hope will contribute to the transparency and the trust that the American people can have in the process. Peggy, you're absolutely right. The terrific people at FDA, incredible scientists, incredible dedication to the public health. And none of us, including most importantly, our career scientists, would want a vaccine approved or authorized that we wouldn't want to give to ourselves or the families.
So let me follow up on that just in terms of a kind of a follow-on question, and maybe Peggy, your perspective, but can you really explain to us how there will be a consultation with NIH, CDC, and ASPR that is recognized as part of the EUA process? And would you make these assessments public, or how much information will be there so that we can understand when you assess this benefit risk calculus that goes into the decisions you have to make?
Well, we've had ongoing consultation with our colleagues at HHS, and we'll continue to do that. Our intention, Mike, is that when or if we make a decision around a vaccine, either through a biological license application or an emergency use authorization, we will be transparent about the information that went into that. Throughout this pandemic, we have consulted with our colleagues at CDC and NIH. Dr. Fauci and I served together in the White House Coronavirus Task Force, and we're in contact several times per week, and we will continue that, and we will not miss that step when it comes to vaccine evaluation.
Peggy, any comment you'd like to make?
No, I mean, I think that there are so many, experienced and knowledgeable people within the orbit of the public health agencies of HHS, NIH, and CDC, BARDA, and the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, as well as the opportunity to engage with external scientists, expert in areas of vaccine research and development. So I think that the more engagement, the more discussion, and as Commissioner Hahn said, the more transparency, the better off we all are, the more real accountability there will be on the decisions made. And I think the better service to the American people and well beyond our borders as well as these critical decisions are made.
Well, in that regard, and both of you have hit on this already, but let me just come back to it because I think it's such an important theme in what we're addressing today here. And this really was a question that we had formulated before this webinar, and asking you about how having a safe and effective vaccine available is one challenge, but another challenge is ensuring the public trusts the vaccine, is willing to actually get vaccinated. And we wanted you to comment on how the public can feel confident that the candidate vaccines are safe and effective, and you've been addressing that. But also, I'd like to raise one other point. Yesterday in the New England Journal of Medicine, an editorial entitled "Dying in Leadership Vacuum," which was a general critique of the federal response to this pandemic to date. There was one particular line that stuck out that I think, Steve, we'd welcome your response to, or your comments. And the line was, "And the Food and Drug Administration has been shamefully politicized, appearing to respond to pressure from the administration rather than the scientific evidence." So when the public reads something like this or hears this, how can we respond, or how do you respond back, assuring them what in fact we're hearing from you right now?
Well, Mike, first of all, I did read that in the New England Journal, and on behalf of the 17,000 plus incredibly dedicated career staff at FDA, I vigorously disagree with that conclusion. Of course, our work on COVID-19 and non-COVID, as Dr. Hamburg mentioned, issues come with unprecedented public scrutiny and sometimes criticism. Our responsibilities are broad and they're far-reaching, but the bottom line is what we can't have is anything that shakes the underlying faith that the public has and should have in our commitment to protecting public health. Now, I have stated publicly before, and I'll state it again, all of our decisions during this pandemic have been made by career scientists based on data and science, not politics. I am incredibly confident in the people at FDA and in the decisions that have been made related to COVID-19 and that will be made in the coming months in response to all of the challenges that we face. And so I state before you now, what I've said before is that we will not authorize or approve any vaccine that we wouldn't want to be administered to our families. We will use science and data to drive those decisions. We will be transparent about those decisions, and we will do everything in our power to prevent anything other than science and data from being involved in those decisions. That's the promise that we at FDA, that I as the Commissioner of Food and Drugs, make to the American people.
Thank you. Peggy, any?
Thank you. Nothing to add to that. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me move forward. Steve, you've highlighted the need for additional near-term safety data, since the majority of serious adverse events following vaccination usually occur within 2 months, as you mentioned. Should an EUA be granted and the vaccine be available, what are the full set of vaccine safety monitoring systems now in place, such as at the FDA, the CDC, the DOD, CMS, or whatever? And what will they be looking for in terms of events as they might occur? And then finally, how will the healthcare community and the public know what these systems are seeing when they're seeing it? And what metrics will be tracked to identify adverse events and the values that might trigger additional investigation into vaccine safety?
So, Mike, you've highlighted a really important part of the emergency use authorization. My analogy is you're a doctor in the emergency room or in a critical care unit. You're making decisions very rapidly based upon somewhat limited information. You make that decision based upon your evaluation of the patient, the data available. As new data come in, you revise that as needed. Sometimes you have to, sometimes you don't. Every doctor has been faced that. This is our situation with EUA. So although the duration of safety follow-up at the time of vaccine that could be authorized under an EUA would almost certainly be shorter than under a biological license application, we'll do safety surveillance, as I mentioned, on the millions of individuals who receive the vaccine. Now, we're going to use both passive reporting of adverse events, which we all know, having performed clinical trials, has its limitations, but we're also going to do active elicitation of adverse events using large computer databases. So from electronic health records, from claims data, et cetera. So we're in the process of working with our partners at Health and Human Services, in particular CDC, and we will be working with any manufacturer that comes forward with an application to make sure that these processes are robust. Now, we have an obligation to the public, number one, to protect the public, but also to inform them should we see any adverse events that we're concerned about. And so what we'll be doing is following our procedures, which we've done throughout the pandemic, but as Dr. Hamburg used previously, we'll be putting out safety alerts and being very transparent about any concerning findings that might occur. And so we believe that the processes we're putting in place, we've been working on this for 2 months with our partners, will allow for identification of any rare or late side effects that might not have been observed in the initial data collected. I'm confident in this approach, but we're going to continue to work, and we're partnering with a number of great organizations to do this.
Thank you. Peggy, any comment?
Well, I might just add that, a real world example of how seriously FDA does take safety concerns is the pause that was taken with the AstraZeneca vaccine product. And, many have noted that it has gone back into clinical trials in some other countries, but FDA committed to taking a very deep dive into the specifics of an adverse event that was reported, a possible vaccine-related event, but to be determined, and also review, all of the information that was available to really make sure that the nature of this event was understood, whether or not there appeared to be any link to the vaccine, and making a determination before continuing the clinical trials. So I think, that is, one example. We know that it is very, very important to do this long-term follow-up as you move from studying a vaccine in a smaller number of people to studying it or seeing it used in a broader set of individuals. And so having those systems for tracking in place is going to be crucial, what was being called pharmacovigilance. Also, making sure that healthcare providers and individuals who receive vaccine understand the importance of their own role in reporting. And of course, companies have an obligation to continue to follow and to continue to report. So I think all of this is crucial as we take a really longer term look at these vaccine products and the critical role that they can and should play in our public health management of this devastating global pandemic.
Thank you.
Mike, if I may just add to what Dr. Hamburg said, that was just beautifully said. This is a normal process for FDA, as Dr. Hamburg knows, to have pharmacovigilance programs around vaccines. So we do have experience. We have a couple of different platforms within the agency that we're looking to expand for this purpose. But I do want to point out that throughout this pandemic, regardless of the medical product, we have had to access real world evidence, whether it's diagnostic tests and their performance in the real world or other therapeutics, to actually inform our decisions and to potentially change our decisions. So this is something that we emphasized during the pandemic, but I think, as Dr. Hamburg mentioned, this is something that is a lesson learned that we should use moving forward, accessing these sort of databases to help us in our decision making and revising them if necessary.
Thank you. So obviously one of the challenges in conducting these studies is enrolling a diverse and representative sample into the clinical trials. What is FDA and its partners doing to ensure that target populations for vaccines are included in the clinical trials, including such groups as children, elderly, immunocompromised, pregnant women, etc.? And I must add that we have received a lot of input from people wanting to know particularly about children, parents who are concerned, will the children have access to the vaccine? Again, a safety issue that is a real concern to them. So maybe you could share with us this great challenge that you have right now.
So this is vitally important that the clinical trials include diverse populations. In our June guidance for vaccines, we made it very clear this diversity isn't just about underrepresented minorities and ethnicity, it's also about age. So are the elderly represented? Because we know that there are differences in how the elderly respond to vaccines in general. So we need that. We also need those with comorbidities included. We had a special section on pregnant and lactating women, and we have expertise on all of these areas both within the agency and also on the Vaccine Advisory Committee. So should we receive an application and data, we can assess these. Now, we've been working very closely with our partners at NIH and CDC, as well as the manufacturers, to ensure that they are looking very closely at this, and this happens on a regular basis, to communicate that we take this seriously. Because at the end of the day, in order for us to achieve our public health mission, the data we see and the decisions we make have to be representative of all Americans who could potentially receive a vaccine. So this is of incredibly high importance to us. And we have an Office for Minority Health and Health Equity that has an ongoing campaign to provide positive reinforcements about education. And we've been working with a number of external groups with respect to this issue. And then just one final issue with respect to this. We fully intend to look when we analyze the data. And as Peggy knows, we're one of the few regulatory agencies that actually looks at raw data at the outcomes in individual groups. Not necessarily saying that that will necessarily influence decision, but that's that important to us that we'll need to look at these various groups and what outcomes we're seeing both on the efficacy and the safety side.
And just to elaborate a little bit, you know, it's crucially important that this work be done, because as we move forward, hopefully we'll have more than one vaccine that meets standards for going into broader use. And they will be vaccines with different characteristics in terms of how they are made and how they work in the body and the kind of immune response that occurs in reaction to them. And that will need to influence the indications for use. There may be certain vaccines that work better in older populations. There may be certain vaccines that are safer and better for use in pregnant women and women of reproductive age. So we really need to keep our eye on the importance of the long term in terms of developing these critical products, recognizing that we're very focused now on the first generation of vaccines, number one, and which one will make it over the finish line first. But at the end of the day, we want multiple different vaccines that can be part of a comprehensive tool set. And we want to keep also elaborating better and better vaccines based on science and experience.
And Mike, just to get to your question about pediatrics, because I neglected to answer that. So we, of course, are also, this is top of mind for us, we provided guidance to manufacturers, but our approach has been, let's look at the safety and efficacy in adults first in these clinical trials that are ongoing right now. As you can see in clinicaltrials.gov, the age range for eligibility is from 18 and above. We know that there is a post-inflammatory syndrome that is rare, but does occur in children who have COVID-19. And of course, top of mind for us is to ensure that any vaccine that gets authorized for children does not lead to those same consequences. So we'll want to make sure that we have really robust safety and efficacy data before moving forward.
In that regard, do you anticipate the initiation of trials at all in children in the upcoming months?
So again, that'll depend on the data that we see, Mike. Just what I mentioned about depends on what we see with respect to efficacy and safety. Of course, we want to expedite the development of a vaccine for children, but we want to really make sure that that's carefully done and thoughtfully considered.
Yeah. And following up on the comment that Peggy, you just made, I will ask it as a question, but I'm inferring, as Peggy just suggested, do you anticipate that multiple COVID-19 vaccines using different platforms will be approved? And if you do the vaccines produced by these different platforms produce different immunologic responses, which then gets into the whole issue of how could, in fact, one vaccine requiring booster doses be interchanged with another vaccine if, in fact, the second dose is not available as was received for the first dose. So how do you see that all coming together here in terms of different platforms and the vaccines administered at least twice?
That's a really great question. And we realize that, and I think it's important, as Peggy described, that there are a number of, if you will, from a sports metaphor, shots on goal here with different platforms and approaches. And I think that's important from a scientific and medical point of view because of precisely what Peggy outlined, which is that we may see that certain vaccines might be more efficacious in one group or another, might be considered safer in one group than another, and we need to inform a national vaccine program based upon those data. Now, that being said, we could speculate regarding what different vaccine platforms might bring to the table versus others, but it would be speculation, and it really is dependent upon the data that we see. Some of the platforms, such as protein subunit platforms, we have more experience with, and so one could make more predictions about those. But again, they're predictions, and they're not based on the science and data that would come from the clinical trials. That being said, as Dr. Hamburg mentioned before, we are working very closely with the manufacturers of all different platforms to make sure that these considerations are in effect when they design their clinical trials and then when they perform and submit the data to us.
Okay,
Mike?
Peggy, yes.
I just was, maybe I could take this opportunity to ask a question myself, something
Please
that's
do.
been on my mind. And, I don't know that there is an absolute answer yet, but how do you think about the impact that the first authorization or approval will have on other ongoing vaccine trials? Because we do want to keep all of these important efforts going forward. We are going to need, more than one vaccine ultimately. And, I think the reality is probably that, the first vaccine over the finish line is not going to end up being the best vaccine in terms of our national and global needs.
So this is a really relevant and important question, and really gets to, I'm going to put it in ethical terms. Is it ethical to continue a trial after approval of one vaccine? And whether trials with a placebo arm can ethically continue after an EUA will depend upon a number of factors. But let me first state what Dr. Hamburg did, which is that FDA, our agency is committed to these randomized placebo-controlled trials. To the extent possible that we can do that from an ethical point of view, we need to continue those trials. But it will depend on a number of factors. So what's the efficacy observed of the first vaccine? So as Dr. Hamburg describes, there are potentially better vaccines that are coming down the pike. That will be an important part of this. And also the safety issues and whether there's authorization of a vaccine for a more limited population. So this is one of the issues that we intend to have further discussion about at our upcoming Public Advisory Committee meeting, which is on October 22nd, 2020. And I think it's really important for vaccine experts to come together, and we should really talk about how we will potentially address this issue moving forward. Mike, just if I could do a plug here, we are opening a public docket for this October 22nd meeting. And there will be, I suspect, a lot of public interest. Not everyone in the public will have the opportunity to speak at this open meeting, but the public docket provides an opportunity for those who have interested to raise questions and concerns that we will then address at some point after that docket is closed. And Mike, if you want, I can provide that docket number to you after this webinar is over.
Thank you. We definitely would welcome that, and we'll promote that for everyone to use. So let me move to a set of questions that really are looking into the future. The first one is, does the agency or its scientists have any sense of an expected duration of protection from the different vaccine platforms? Are we looking at what type of durability of immunity?
Well, as you probably know, as the infectious disease expert, we've had questions about innate immunity and how long that had lasted. And so we don't know the answer to this really terrific question. But what I can tell you is that the trials that are being performed have in place monitoring of immune response, and we should be able to collect data that will inform that. And again, we need to be flexible in our authorization or approval process to account for any changes that might occur with respect to the duration of immune response.
Thank you.
And of course, we still need to really ascertain what are the correlates of immune protection, because the body does mount a fairly complex immune response, and some elements are more crucial to protection than others, to be sure, but we still haven't really fully defined that. So we are in a period of continuing learning and investigation, even as we are moving forward in vaccine development issues. And again, this isn't entirely novel in the experience of vaccine development.
This is a really important point, and it's one of the reasons that we insisted in our June 30th guidance that there be a primary clinical endpoint as opposed to an immunologic endpoint, because we don't know the answer to the questions, what are the immune correlates of the clinical immune response? So protection from acquisition of COVID-19 is the most important question in the beginning. As we collect those data, we'll have more information to inform subsequent trials.
The second question, in terms of looking off into the future, really comes back to the issue of safety. And we recognize that there is no answer for this yet, but we would welcome your perspective. Americans want to be reassured that these novel vaccines won't have long-term side effects, something several years out, et cetera. Can you provide any commentary on how you're looking at that, how that'll be tracked, and what the message should be to the public in terms of what we know about these vaccines now?
So first thing for the public and for the great providers of this country is every application will be taken on a case-by-case basis. One of the factors that will be considered both by us and the advisory committee will be, is this a novel platform? What is the experience with the platform in humans who've received vaccines or not with this platform in the past? And that has to be part of the risk-benefit calculus. But I think another reassuring part of this, if under an EUA or emergency use authorization, there is an authorization of a vaccine, we will insist upon a very rigorous follow-up tracking of side effects, both passive submission of adverse events, but also an active look in medical records, claims data, et cetera, as I mentioned before, for those side effects, because it is our responsibility to ensure that we identify in real time adverse events that might be unexpected. So it'll have to go into our decision up front. It'll have to go very much into our pharmacovigilance program, and as well as the transparency and communication with providers and patients about those adverse events should they occur.
Thank you. I just want to come back to a point that we discussed a moment ago, just for to be sure that we're very clear on this, as we have a number of very interested individuals, some who are actually participating in the trials. But the question has come back again to the fact that if, in fact, one vaccine is found to meet the criteria for emergency use authorization, that is given to that vaccine, what will happen to the other placebo-controlled trials for the other candidates that are out there? What can they anticipate? What will that mean? Given that, as Peggy said earlier, and as did you, Steve, there is going to be one right vaccine yet. We will be learning, and likely better vaccines will be coming with each iteration of research.
Well, first of all, again, I want to stress we are committed to the performance of randomized controlled trials. That's the gold standard to assess vaccine efficacy and safety. We are, of course, very sensitive to the ethical issues here. And Mike, I cannot prejudge what the data will show. This is what the experts at FDA do. This is what experts in the vaccine world who come to the Vaccine Advisory Committee do. And when we will make a determination around that based upon a number of factors, including the efficacy that's observed with the first vaccine that comes through the process. So I can't tell you what the answer will be. What I can tell you is top of mind. And we will take the ethical as well as the clinical and the development considerations into account.
And it sounds as though there will be an opportunity for a robust public discussion when you have the advisory committee meeting later this month, and an opportunity for FDA scientists, industry scientists, and external experts to all engage on this issue, and also to hear some public comment on this issue as well.
Absolutely, Dr. Hamburg. And as you know, we posted online on Tuesday the materials for the October 22nd meeting. We're going to have a general discussion about vaccine development. This is a critical meeting, and I encourage members of this group to submit comments and relevant, obviously, observations and concerns regarding all of the issues we've brought up today, because they need to be on the table, and we need to have an open and transparent discussion about them.
Thank you. We've had a series of inquiries about the benefit with COVID-19 vaccination to actually test someone for COVID antibodies, particularly if they've been previously diagnosed, should they get vaccinated again, or if you're a healthcare worker, one of the priority areas where we know we have an increased occurrence of individuals who are appearing to be antibody positive. Is there any thought to what to do about people who have been diagnosed prior, and for those who may have been infected, but not yet aware of it, particularly for those in high-risk groups like healthcare workers?
So we've been very carefully considering this question. It's a very important one, and we've been communicating with the developers of vaccines. So sponsors may be testing for antibodies prior to vaccination, but we're recommending to them that they enroll all eligible volunteers, because we believe it'll be too cumbersome to test everyone before they are vaccinated. So again, this gets to the diversity and the generalizability of the results. In the real world setting, we believe it's too cumbersome to test everyone before the vaccination. So we also know that the clinical trials are looking at immune response and potentially some of them collecting antibody data and potentially also other immune data before the vaccine's administered. So we look forward, if those data are available, to evaluating them and making that determination and having that discussion internally and with the Vaccine Advisory Committee.
Thank you. Producing vaccines at scale isn't merely doubling the recipe. What have you done to ensure that vaccines produced in large quantities are the same as those produced in smaller lots for the clinical trials? In particular, how will quality control for manufacturing be monitored over time? You know, with reports the vaccines are already being produced in advance of approval, how can the American public be confident that these vaccines manufactured prior to approval are safe and have received the proper oversight for their use?
So this really gets back to the issue of how can you expedite vaccine development in a way that maintains our rigorous standards. And so we've been working with manufacturers over manufacturing control and quality data throughout the pandemic, and particularly with vaccines since the summer when the development process was initiated and when the manufacturing was started. So we've had a sort of a runway, if you will, to look at these data, and that has been an ongoing rolling assessment. Our absolute commitment to the American people is that we will ensure that vaccines that are produced under an authorization or an approval will have the appropriate quality controls in place. We've been working on that. We've been involved in working with the manufacturers over inspections, and we will continue to do that. And before a vaccine is authorized or approved, we will ensure that those safety and quality standards are met.
Good, thank you.
And
Peggy?
I'll just add one thought here, if I may. You know, one of the things that has been extraordinary about this vaccine development effort, and Steve touched on it earlier, is the investment in manufacturing now of vaccine candidates that we don't yet know whether they'll make it over the finish line in terms of the determination of safety and efficacy. It's an extraordinary risk financially, because you may be starting to manufacture large quantities of vaccine that will never be used. But it also, I think, is giving an opportunity to, before the vaccine is actually needed in the field, to work with the companies, look at how the scale up in manufacturing is happening, address any quality or other manufacturing concerns that may be emerging. It will certainly accelerate the time from any kind of an authorization or approval to actually getting the vaccine out to people. And it will probably actually improve the quality of the manufacturing process.
I think that's absolutely right, Peggy. And this runway I described, the head start, if you will, has been given to us because of the manufacturing at risk. And we've been working hard at this all summer. So I think that's absolutely spot on. And we'll continue to do it because, I mean, obviously, as more and more vaccines come on, we'll have to spend more and more time with them, both before or after a potential authorization or approval.
We actually have had a series of questions addressed to us that are really trying to get at the issue of risk factors. People are trying to understand would I be eligible for, and would it be safe for me to consider taking vaccine if I fall into groups such as immune compromised individuals, the elderly, even to the extent that looking at the response to the vaccine among those with increased body mass indexes, which for other vaccines has been shown to be a deterrent to a robust response. Can you comment on that in terms of how FDA is looking at this, working with the companies, and how we communicate to this part of our public what they might anticipate?
So it's one of the reasons that diversity writ large is important for the clinical trials. And in our June 30th guidance, I've mentioned a couple times, we spoke to this issue because of the medical and clinical factors you just described, Mike. So we want to see data in appropriate groups of individuals, large BMI, cardiac disease, hypertension, immunosuppressed for a variety of reasons, that within the trials, obviously within the parameters of the eligibility of the trial, so that we can actually help to make that determination, because all of those factors will be very important as we consider the label around any potential authorization and approval process. Now, I can't speak to specific conditions because we haven't seen the data yet, but it is why we have been very much emphasizing the fact that diversity around risk factors is an incredibly important part of these phase 3 clinical trials. When we see those data, we will have a summary of those clinical data. That summary and those data will be shared with our vaccine advisory committee, and those materials will be transparent to the public. And I think we can have a very robust discussion about that when or if an application is submitted.
Thank you. Peggy, any comments on that?
Well, just, as was just said, the data needs to continue to be elaborated and examined as indications for use are developed. Then it will be very important to work with other partners, both within government, CDC, very, very importantly in terms of recommendations for use, but also healthcare providers and others. And so, it's the time now to be beginning to think about our systems for communication and our networks and making sure that the systems are in place. Certainly that's also true, profoundly true, when it comes to distribution of the vaccine and the ability to have systems to track people so that we know what vaccine they got, know what second dose of vaccine they will need and when, and also to make sure that we have the systems for tracking for ongoing assessment of possible emerging safety concerns and continuing our understanding of the efficacy of the vaccines, the duration of protection, the potential differences between subpopulations, et cetera. So, what FDA is doing is crucially important. It has to be married with a set of other partners and stakeholders as the work goes forward and as the vaccine begins to move actually out into broader use, first starting with priority groups as we have limited quantities of vaccine, but then broader uptake and usage as well.
And Mike, just to follow up on what Peggy said, just to clarify, FDA is the regulatory authority, obviously, around approval or authorization of vaccines. But the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP for short, they make the recommendations on the populations of individuals who would receive them. We've been in very close contact with Dr. Redfield in the CDC because we will be able to hand off very quickly, if we have an authorization or approval to them, the information that went into that authorization or approval, so that they can make that available to their advisory committee, and we can expeditiously decide upon a national vaccine program with an emphasis on those who typically, might not have access quickly, the underrepresented, those in poorer communities. We need to make sure that we're assessing and making sure that this vaccine is available to all Americans.
Could you give us a sense of where FDA is right now in terms of its collaboration and cooperation with the other regulatory agencies around the world, particularly your colleagues in Europe and other countries in China and Russia and so forth, in terms of what kind of collaboration is being done and how are we sharing regulatory science information that can be cooperative and additive to each of the various organizations' efforts?
Mike, that's an excellent question, and Dr. Hamburg knows this very well. FDA has mutual recognition agreements with a number of foreign regulatory entities. For example, I have been in regular touch with the EMA. We have a regular call where we discuss our response to COVID-19 as well as theirs. And this, of course, includes vaccines, but other therapeutics as well. And under the mutual recognition agreement, we're able to share information. That has been incredibly helpful with respect to understanding where potential applications are, what information is being received, to ensure that we have alignment around, for example, criteria, assessment. Now, the rules and regulations are different, and the way that applications are assessed is different. But that discussion is ongoing with a number of regulatory agencies and will continue as we move forward. It's really critical that we have that alignment.
Thank you.
I just want to underscore how important this is. I mean, I think that we do live in a globalized world. Science is a global enterprise. And importantly, we're trying to address a global pandemic. And so the more that there can be collaboration, alignment, sharing of information, the better off all of our countries will be. At the end of the day, every regulatory authority has to answer to its own people and its own legal regulatory framework. But there are real opportunities to strengthen each individual regulatory authority and its work by working together and collaborating to sharing workload in many cases. And there's real benefit to ultimately consumers and patients if these different regulatory authorities can align in various ways to reduce administrative burden and serial bureaucratic processes as well. So there's a lot of benefit both on the science, the regulatory decision-making, and the administrative functions that I think have proven their value in COVID, and we need to continue to work on this kind of cooperation.
Well, we only have 4 minutes left, and I want to give both of you an opportunity for kind of a closing comment and a sense of direction of where we're going. And so I'm going to start with you first, Peggy. If just based on today's conversation and your experience over your FDA days, but more importantly, you have had such incredible exposure to so many aspects of public health and have provided leadership. What advice might you have for your former agency in terms of how they move forward?
Well, this is, truly an unprecedented time, and the demands have been enormous. First, I want to thank all of the staff at the FDA who have been working night and day for months since we first learned about the emergence of this novel coronavirus. The work that FDA does is unique and essential. It's often undervalued, but it's central to the critical needs of American citizens every single day, and even more so in a global crisis like this. And I guess one thought for Steve, I'm sure you know some of the history that Teddy Roosevelt started the FDA back in 1906, President Roosevelt, and was very committed to FDA and committed to the notion that we needed to bring the best possible science to bear on these important decisions in order to protect consumers and promote health. And he was once quoted as saying, "The greatest gift in life is to work hard at work worth doing." That was a quote that I often used while I was at the FDA, and I hope you can find some comfort in it yourself, because the work you're doing is certainly worth doing.
Thank you. Very wise and thoughtful words. Steve, I'll turn it over to you for the kind of closing comments from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Mike. First of all, thanks for having me the opportunity to be here. As Peggy said, FDA is the nation's oldest consumer protection agency, and we really have set the gold standard for review of medical products. And over the past 10 months, it's been an incredible honor to work shoulder to shoulder with the unbelievably well-versed and experienced FDA career staff. They've They fought this historic pandemic that has literally altered the lives of every American, and I am incredibly proud of them. I just want to close with making the following commitment to this group and to the American people. FDA will not authorize or approve any vaccine for COVID-19 or therapeutic before it has met our rigorous standards for safety and effectiveness. And any decision to approve or authorize a vaccine or therapeutic will be made by the dedicated career staff using our standard and rigorous review procedures. And science will guide our decisions. And I will not, and FDA will not allow pressure from anybody to change that. We plan to fight for science. We will fight for the integrity of the agency, and we will always put the interests of the American people ahead of anything, and that includes any personal considerations. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm really happy to be back at any time to discuss these important topics.
Well, thank you. And I just want to close in saying that some people would say that I have, over the course of my career, been outspoken and sometimes critical. I would say that, sessions like this and my opportunity to work with the FDA staff, including yourself, Steve, and the excellent work that's being done there, gives me great reassurance that the process is working just like it should, with all the right reasons for doing what's being done. And I, as a father and grandfather, have immense confidence in what you're doing. And I would only say in closing, Godspeed, because we need you. Every day, 500 to 1,000 people in this country are dying from this disease, many, many more around the world. And, a vaccine can't come soon enough. But if one comes too soon, that doesn't meet the standards of safety and effectiveness, we all in public health will surely be challenged. So you have our full support, and we're here to support you however we can. And I just want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule. Peggy, you too. Thank you very much for your wise commentary and input. And on behalf of all of us here at the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, thank you to the audience for being with us today. This particular session will be archived. It will be available immediately afterwards, and it can be obtained from our website. So thank you again, and all of you have a great day, and let's beat this virus. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy.
Thank you.